When Mr. Anderton reached out to me about this program a few weeks ago, I thought, oh, we'd be lucky to get 10 people. And this is the crowd we have. So without further ado, here is Anthony Anderton to present on the, am I saying it right, Cahans Exodus.
That will do, that's fine.
Okay, and so let's begin.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure everyone's in the right place. I think earlier today this was where you were filing your tax returns. If you were, this is the Cahans Exodus presentation. Can you hear me down the back? Yeah? Okay, I need to speak up? Yes, okay. So the topic I put very generally up here is the Cahans Exodus of 1764 from Ballybay in County Monaghan to Salem. I am quite sure that many of you here are far more knowledgeable and familiar with this than I am. But what I wanted to do through the presentation was really put my personal experience of it on and share with you some of the things that I've done. And I'd be really interested in any observations or comments, corrections to any mistakes that I might make would be welcome as well. Before I begin, I really wanted to thank Karen and Melissa at the library. They've been fantastic in organising this. You know, sitting in Brisbane, thousands and thousands of miles away, thinking that all I'm doing is annoying people in a town on the other side of the world, asking them to do things when they're already busy. And I'm extremely grateful to them and everyone else who's made me so welcome here this week. I hope you enjoy my presentation. And if you do really want to stop me at any time, please do so. I don't mind that. It's sometimes better to wait till the end, but we may never get to the end, so we'll start. One of the things that really struck me about this, and I guess it's anything to do with the history of Ireland and the countries linked with it, it just seems to be that over and over you see patterns emerging that seem to echo down not through generations but centuries. And I think through this I was struck how many times on so many different levels seeing the same thing, not repeating but just, as Mark Twain would say, rhyming. The Exodus, as we refer to it, probably started in some fields like this just outside Ballybay. This is typical Monaghan, North Monaghan countryside. I'm sure it looked like this in 1764. Nothing much has changed. It was already deforested. The British had cut down all the Irish forests for their navy, so the great Irish forests were gone. And you'll see these lovely rolling hills, which are called drumlins, which were caused during the Ice Age when the ice scoured out the landscape. And these egg-shaped hills are one of the defining characteristics of the Monaghan countryside. And if any of you are familiar with the poetry of Patrick Kavanagh from Monaghan, he writes about the drumlins in many of his works. Thomas Clark, Reverend Thomas Clark, and his congregation of about 300 men, women and children had gathered in that field or in a field probably close to the site of this meeting house, which wasn't built at the time, but they probably had a meeting house of some sort in the area. And the reason they had gathered was that the whole congregation, some 300 people, had agreed to follow Clark to America en masse, to pack up. They would have sold off their tenancies, they would have sold their possessions, I'm sure, to immigrate to the United States. And you'll see the word Cahans, or C-A-H-A-N-S, it's pronounced differently. No one's really sure the origin or the meaning of the term. It's in the townlands of Lisnaveen, which is close to Ballybay, but Cahans has become the term for it. So that's the current meeting house, which I'll come back to later. And this is Ballybay, which is my link to Ireland. So it's a busy, or not as busy it used to be, market town in Monaghan with a long history. And at the time of Clark's decision to take his flock to America, it would have been a very, very busy market town for cattle, horses, grain, but most of all flax and linen, which was the big money earner for most farmers. And that's a picture of the high street in Ballybay about 2 years ago. Pretty typical morning there. When Clark and his flock set off on foot, they would have walked through country lanes just like this, which are dotted all over this part of Monaghan. And these are the sorts of roads that lead in and out of the meeting house I've told you. So it's not in the town, it's further out. I suspect in their day the roads would have been much rougher and more difficult, but as you can see, it's quite beautiful countryside that it passes through, and to this day it's like this. You think you're a long way from anywhere driving in the back roads. Their journey on foot was to the port of Neeley. Is anybody familiar with that part of Northern Ireland? Carlingford Loch. It's really on the border between the north and the south. And in fact, the border of Ireland and Northern Ireland runs right up the middle of the loch. So Neeley, where they were walking to, had become a very busy transatlantic port. And from America, it was bringing flaxseed, timber, rum, and a lot of sugar from the West Indies plantations for processing. And in return, the Irish were sending back to the United States and the colonies meat, flax, linen, and people. So people were filling the ships going back, and it's important. They weren't passenger ships, they were cargo ships. We think that where they boarded ship and left from is a place called Narrowwater. And this is the Narrowwater Castle, which is on the river below Neeley. It dates back to the Norman times. It's always been a fortification that protected the approaches to the city. Nobody knows for sure where they got on their ship, but it was somewhere around here, and they began their journey to the United States. So that's the nutshell of the story. They of course made a transatlantic crossing in something like this. It would have been horrendous. It would have been below decks, no portholes, no ventilation, no sanitation, poor food and water, and a dangerous crossing for many times. But Clark and his congregation made it safely across, I think in roughly 6 weeks, which was not always the case. They made their way to New York. This is not the view that he saw, but I suspect they wouldn't have made the journey further north if they had. And they made it here to your wonderful town, which was not, of course, called Salem, but they christened it New Perth because officially it reminded them of their origins in Scotland. But I'm convinced that, in fact, that Thomas Clark was a master marketer and advertiser, and he had another reason for calling it New Perth, which I'll come to in my view later. So I'll stop there, and before I get into the detail, the question everybody asks me is, why am I doing this and what's my connection? So what's an Australian living on the other side of the world? I spent most of my professional career working in the Asia Pacific and in China, nothing to do with Ireland at all. And the answer is very simple. It's my mother. And my mother was born in Ballybay and raised there, and left as a young woman to live in Belfast, and then immigrated from the north of Ireland in the 50s, when her generation of young Catholics had no future in the north as it was because of discrimination, lack of opportunity. There was no housing, there were no jobs, and so she left. But over the decades since, she always ensured that my sister and I went with her for visits to home, as she never stopped calling it. It was always home. And over the decades, we went to Ballybay many, many times to visit family and to travel. So in my mind, there's a very strong, at least emotional and nostalgic connection with the town. When she died in 2014, we decided that we would have her ashes interred with her parents in Belfast, and we did that in 2015, and we made a visit to Ballybay as a family. And my cousin took me round to all the family sites, and right at the end of the trip, he took me to the Cahans meeting hall, just out of randomness. And he said, "Oh, I think you'll find this interesting." So we walked in. This is 2015. The renovations were already underway. The building was in terrible shape. It was nearly falling down. And two things really struck me about the visit was, first of all, I had no idea of the Presbyterian history of my mother's town, because her tradition and the Presbyterian tradition were completely parted. In her time, they did not connect in any way. But secondly was my cousin. You can see Paul here. Paul was incredibly enthusiastic about the meeting hall and told me a bit about the Presbyterian tradition, told me a little bit about the Exodus. And I realised he was part of a cross-community group that was raising funds to restore the meeting house. And that really struck me, is that in modern Ireland, which is trying to free itself from sectarian conflict. All the faith groups came together in Ballybay and were working together to restore the Presbyterian meeting house, which I was very struck by. The story stayed with me, and in 2023, this is all very personal, I went to visit my son in London, thought I'd visit Ballybay. What's happening in the town? Not much, except the official opening of the meeting house. I couldn't believe, random, I had no idea. So I went along to the meeting and I met this gentleman, David Nesbitt. And I think David Moore has met David in Ballybay several times. He is the retired Presbyterian minister. I would say he's the driving force behind the Cahans project and has arranged many of the activities. He's written several books on the history of the Presbyterian Church in Ballybay and Monaghan. That's his new book sitting in front of him. And I wouldn't have been able to do what I did without David's support, and he emailed me yesterday, sort of sending me good wishes and good luck, but also wanting to reach out to the community here because he would really like to deepen the connections and the interplay between the two communities if he can, or in some way. So, details. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the geography of Ireland. I'm not a great graphic designer, so this is the best map I could give you. So, I don't know if you can see Monaghan just there. Okay. And Neeley is in this little finger of water there at the mouth of Carlingford Lock, which opens into the Irish Sea. So Monaghan is traditionally one of the 9 provinces of Ulster. And you'll often hear that term Ulster. Modern Ulster is only 6. So when Ireland was partitioned in 1921, 6 counties were put into the north, and 3, including Monaghan, were carved off into the south. And so hence that division. So, who were Clark's congregation and what did they do? They were predominantly lowland Scots Presbyterians who had joined the plantation of Ulster mainly from the 1690s onwards. And they settled on land that the British Crown had confiscated from the native Irish to give to groups of people they thought would, one, be more loyal and reliable and wouldn't rise up and fight them, were more hard-working. The view that the Catholic Irish were lazy and wouldn't do anything. So these hard-working Scots would come in and make people a fortune. So they flocked in there. I think at least 100,000, maybe more, travelled from the lowlands of Scotland to the north of Ireland beginning in the 1690s, often fleeing famine and poor harvests themselves. This is one of the rhymes of history. They were led to believe they were going to a promised land with better crops, better production, a better life. Things didn't quite work out that way. What did they do? Clark's congregation were tenant farmers. Presbyterians by law were not allowed to own land. Under the penal laws they could not own real estate land. That didn't change for nearly 100 years after this event. So there were tenant farmers, they were weavers, they were itinerant labourers, there were some people with some skilled trades and crafts, and a smattering of merchants, but this was not a wealthy group of people. These were very hard-working people who probably were living in quite difficult circumstances. And the big why comes up is, we know who they were, we know what they did. Ballybay itself was as I've mentioned, was a booming market town. So the question would be, is why would 300 men, women and children who had already moved one nation to another get up and leave again? And it comes to this great phrase that I saw. The Irish have been for centuries what is described a people in motion. It just seems to be generation after generation, under different circumstances. It is a net exporter of people and has been right deep into the 20th century, I think. Even up until my mother's time, is that Irish people were continuing to leave for various reasons at various times. And the Scots-Irish immigration is really quite astonishing. I had no concept of the scale of the movement of people from Ireland to to America. So in these two time frames, these were the two main periods of movement, the first beginning sort of 1710 to the start of the American Revolution, and then after the Revolution through to the War of 1812. One author estimates 400,000 Scots-Irish Presbyterians may have migrated to the United States. Now I've seen different, they vary, but there's no doubt that it was in the hundreds of thousands, which, if you look at the proportion of the population of the two places at the time, that is very, very significant. And why Exodus? And everyone asks, why is it called an Exodus? It is typically cast in religious terms, is that Clark and his congregation often referred to a flight out of Egypt, fleeing persecution to go to the promised land, to the land of Canaan and milk and honey. That's the way they rhetorically described their trip. I think it's a little more complicated than that, but this is one of the great quotes that I came across from a Presbyterian minister writing quite early. Can everybody read that, or I'll just read it out? God has appointed a country for them to dwell in and desires them to depart thence, where they will be freed from the bondage of Egypt, and go ye to the land of Canaan. Oh, it's very dramatic, isn't it? Like, it's a sort of Cecil B. DeMille sort of. And this is a letter written by James Harshaw, who was one of Clark's congregation. This was his last letter he wrote from Salem home to Ballybay shortly before he died. And this is his description of what he told his friends and family back in Ireland. We were hastened out of Ireland like the Israelites were hastened out of Egypt by Moses. And one of the little thoughts that started to dawn on me here was, which I'll come back again to later, is I wonder if amongst the Presbyterian population there was a sense of betrayal, is that during the Williamite Wars of 1690s and other conflicts, they had been loyal to the British Crown in defending the realm against the Catholic pretender, James and others. They had fought many of the big battles in Northern Ireland. They had been part of the successful defence of Derry. But yet in Ireland they were treated as a subversive group. They were discriminated against. They didn't suffer quite as much as the Catholics under the penal laws, but very, very harsh nonetheless. And it did occur to me that there was a deep sense of betrayal, that they had shown their loyalty over and over, but yet remained distrusted by the British authorities and the Church of Ireland. So what I wanted to divide the elements of this into are two things that I think drove this mass emigration. Religion's no doubt one of them, but I think it's much more complex than that. So I divided into what I call push forces and pull forces. And the push came from conditions in Ireland and in Monaghan itself. And it's a list, but you had the penal laws, which I've mentioned. So under the penal laws, the Presbyterians could not hold public office. A Presbyterian marriage was not valid unless it was witnessed and went through a supervision from the Church of Ireland. I mentioned that Presbyterians couldn't own land. They were forced to take the oath of loyalty. There were any number of things that irked people. Effectively, they were socially and politically disenfranchised. There was a lack of religious freedom. They were seen as nonconformists. The dominant church, of course, was the Church of Ireland, which was the hierarchical religion in Ireland. Tithes and taxes. Everybody had to pay a 10% tax or tithe to the Church of Ireland. So for people living on marginal land with expensive tenancies, uncertain food supply, this was a huge economic imposition and greatly resented, because the money did not go to their own community, it did not go back into their own coffers, it went to the Church of Ireland. There was a thing called rent racking. So when they first went to Ireland, they were given very advantageous lease agreements, very low prices. As soon as the leases fell due, the landlords racked up those prices. So they went from being in a position of privilege to a marginal existence. Ireland, through the early 1700s, people don't realise it's had several famines. Long before the Great Hunger of the 1840s and 50s, Monaghan had a famine in 1740. Although, as my Irish relatives insist on saying, there was never a famine, there was only a great hunger. Because there was always plenty of food. It just some people didn't get access to it. Land shortages, as population increased, of course, available land decreased. And disease, I hadn't realised there was smallpox and other illnesses ran through the community. So it's not looking very good, really, if you're a low-income farmer in the middle of Monaghan on fairly unproductive land. Things haven't really worked out all that well. So this is all starting to look pretty good. So one of the first things I noticed is that 3 of the American colonies that I read about, Massachusetts, New England and the Carolinas, actively offered free or low-cost frontier land to Scots Presbyterians. They advertised it in Ireland, come on over. And of course they were quite happy for them to go out on the edge of the frontier and be a buffer against difficult things. Same reason the English had sent them to Ireland, to be a buffer against the Irish Catholics. Here, that didn't last very long. The British, I think, government put a stop to a lot of those programs. There are a lot of land speculators and developers here, and they ran very effective campaigns in Ireland in promoting the availability of good, cheap land to people. Shipping firms had sprung up, so the links I mentioned between Newry and America, Belfast, Larne, other ports, the ships came with goods, they had to go back with something, people. A lot of them were indentured labourers or indentured people, which must have been a really, really terrible existence for people. Their passage was paid for by an employer and they had to work that off over sometimes up to a decade. But Clark's people were not indentured, they paid their own passage. There were travelling agents who went around the country knocking on doors, I suspect, telling people to go. There were newspaper ads. But the most important thing, I think, apologies to Alistair Cook, were letters from America. And this is a letter that the Reverend Boyd sent home to Ireland to be read from the pulpit at the service. Read this letter and look, and tell all the poor folk of your place that God has opened a door for their deliverance. So the letters that I've seen reproduced from the time that survive speak of free land or low-cost land, no bailiffs, no taxes, no oppression, no government interference, freedom to worship. So people were getting letters from their friends, from their relatives, and the preachers themselves, the reverends, were getting the call to take people away. And I think that those letters were incredibly important. Well, now the big question is, and this is the sliding door moment. So up until now, I think 80% of Scots Presbyterians had gone through Philadelphia. That was the preferred destination. Very, very few found their way to New York and upstate New York. They did, but in small numbers. And it could have gone any other way. Clark himself had received a call to go to Rhode Island and had calls to go to other places. But he ended up choosing Salem. And this is where 2 critical individuals come into play. And so this is where history often turns on the actions of one or two people. Clark himself, who we know a little bit about, and a gentleman named Robert Harper, or spelled Harper sometimes. Is anyone familiar with Robert Harper at all? Not particularly well known. So Clark himself was born in Scotland. He trained as a theologian in Glasgow, and it appears that he had some degree of medical training. I was talking to Al Cormier about this. At the very least, he did a diploma in medicine at Glasgow University. He may actually have qualified as a medical doctor. It is unclear, but he definitely had medical training. He fought in the Jacobite Wars as a volunteer, which is where he may have applied his medical skills. And he probably fought at the Battle of Culloden when Bonnie Prince Charlie was finally defeated and the English king sort of won the day. Clark was a seceder, so he was a member of a Presbyterian group that broke away from the Associate Church in Scotland on the grounds of doctrine. They wanted to go back to a more conservative, simple, traditional mode of worship and belief. Clark himself was called to Ballybay as a minister because his community were seceders and they liked his style. Clark is reported to have been Tall, gaunt, dark, liked wearing a Scottish bonnet, often wore a kilt, and he claimed to be a member of the Black Douglas clan. He got about on horseback. He was regarded as uncouth, eccentric, but homely and convincing. And he seemed to have a magnetism that drew people to him. So he, on horseback, scoured the Irish countryside around Ballybay for many towns around, and he grew his congregation, and he grew the Presbyterian community of seceders quite dramatically, which caused him a few problems. One of them was that he was imprisoned. He refused to do a thing called kissing the book, which under the British the Test Act, to show loyalty to the Crown, you have to kiss the book, kiss the Bible. He thought this was blasphemy, and he refused to kiss the book. The other elders of the previous Presbyterian who had been dislodged by Clark, because in the Presbyterian tradition, the community calls on a new minister, which means they probably get rid of someone else. So the people that were replaced were, it would appear, quite resentful of Clark, found out about his refusal to take the oath and had him imprisoned in Monaghan jail for a number of months. Personal experience of that discrimination. The other thing that might have pushed him to leave was that in 1762 his wife died and one of his infant children died. They were both buried outside the mission, the Cahans meeting house. And he had a sister-in-law who was living near Albany, probably at Stillwater, who must have written to him, I'm sure, about what had happened to her. So that's Clark. Robert Harper was born in Ballybay, and he was educated at the University of Glasgow during the onset of the Scottish Enlightenment. So he was a professor of mathematics and science who was the only Presbyterian appointed to the faculty at what was then called King's College in New York, or Columbia University now. So it was an Episcopalian university. He was a real outlier. Harper's parents must have known Clark because they had come from Scotland, and it appears that at some point they started corresponding. I'm not sure who wrote to whom first, but it appears that Clark communicated to Harper that he had a desire to take his community to America. Harper assisted by petitioning the governor of New York to get them land. And so they had surveyed a tract of land near Lake George, I believe, and that Clark and his flock believed that when they arrived here, that's where they would settle, is that Harper had arranged that land for them. A couple of other anecdotes about Harper. He eventually lost his job at Columbia through some scandal, which they think was engineered by one of his students, a guy named, I think, Robert Vardil, who turned out to be an English spy, and later fled the country back to England up during the Revolution. But Harper became the librarian of Columbia. His most gifted student was Alexander Hamilton, and Harper tutored Hamilton in mathematics. And people believe that most of Hamilton's expertise in financial modelling and gunnery were probably as a result of Harper's mathematics, which is kind of interesting. I found a little document, there's a copy of it in the Albany State Archives. 10 years after the War of Independence finished, Harper presented Hamilton with an invoice for unpaid tutorial fees of some 10 guineas, which Alexander Hamilton duly paid. Both documents are in the file. So very quickly, I don't want to take too long here. I'll go through this fairly quickly. So they went to Newry, as I've mentioned, and did the Atlantic crossing. They would have booked passage. Passage cost between £3 and £9 a person, a lot of money in the 1760s. So my assumption is that they must have sold up everything. They would have sold up their tenancies, leases on land, they would have sold their possessions just to get to America, men, women and children. The ships weren't great. Their crossing only took 6 weeks. They did very, very well, but I found other ones, and the example I've got here is a ship named the Sally, which ended up taking 15 or 16 weeks to make the crossing, and 63 people lost their lives. Clark and his congregation, guided no doubt by the hand of Providence, did not have any problems. And I put this in full here because I think it really is interesting. Their arrival was reported in the newspaper of the day in New York. I know that's really small print, but I will read it because I think contained in it some really interesting things about the group. So it says the ship that arrived, so they embarked on the 10th with their stores, farming, manufacturing utensils, so it appears that they brought things with them, which I had not seen reported before. And they took 2 sloops up the river to Albany, Lake George, and the land was surveyed for them. Now that's the first point, is that the land had not actually been officially given to them. It was still being surveyed. And Harper had promised each family would get, I think, 400 acres. So they were expecting when they arrived in Lake George or Stillwater that they would have land waiting for them. I thought this is great. Their principal view is to carry on the linen and hemp manufacturing which they all brought up with. So that was going to be a major disappointment, I think, that when they realised where they were with the winter coming on. Doubt they will meet with the good graces of every friend of this province, and it is absolutely necessary, and it is said that many others will soon follow their laudable example, which is true. So very quickly they did make their way up the Hudson to Stillwater and to Lake George. My understanding is that they took on work to make ends meet, and a lot of the men worked in the timber industry around Lake George in sawmilling and lumber. But the reality is that it didn't go well for them. They really hated the place. The winter was atrociously cold. They thought it was dark. They described it as desolate. And it looks like they put the hard word on Clark to find somewhere else, because he was their leader, he was their guiding light. So he got on his horse and I gather scoured most of North New York looking for a new home, and came to Salem. And what was then, as I understand it, the Turner patent. So Turner and Conkey had the patent of land over Salem. They had given or assigned half of it to 2 land developers in New York. Clark decided this is the place. So he went down to New York and he negotiated with, I think it's Dubois and Delancey, with the land developers. He stayed in New York. It took him a month, according to the record, 30 days of negotiation before he got the right terms. So they got 5 years rent-free, and over the next couple of years, gradually the families came. The men first to clear the land and build some cabins, and then the families followed. And so by 1777, the congregation had settled, and the rest is history. What I left out is that in New York, half the group split off. Nobody knows why. Perhaps they quarrelled, perhaps they had different views. One perception is that the land agents got at them, so half of his congregation went to Carolina and settled in a place called Abbeville, Long Cane, Cedar Springs, where they still have a community and still retain strong links back to the Ballybay Church. I've never been there, but there is a definite connection that still exists to that group. So what happened to these, I won't go into the Salem history from then on because I think you will know it far better than I do, but what I thought would be interesting as a postscript is Clark and Harper. Is after arriving in Salem, Clark seems to have been the dynamo of his community at least. He was a doctor, tended to the sick. He preached not just in Salem, or as they called it, New Perth, but Argyll, other towns, on horseback. He was relentless in his work. He was obviously thoroughly motivated in what he did, but he was also rent collector. So it was his job every year to go around to his flock and collect the 5 shillings. And he put the money in a bag and he carried it on horseback to New York to pay the property developers every year, and back again on horseback. He had a few other interesting times here. I won't go into the detail, but he presided over a witch trial here in Salem. Is that Margaret Telford and her husband were accused by their neighbours of witchcraft. the cow's cream wouldn't curdle or curdled incorrectly. I think it was a land dispute. Maybe an overhanging branch or someone hadn't cleared the snow. So they were accused of witchcraft and Clark was called in to adjudicate. I'm not aware of the resolution. Nobody was burned or drowned. It seemed to just go away. I think there's some people in the room who know a little bit about this. Clark, it seems he started moving backwards and forwards and visiting the community in South Carolina. And at some point, either he fell out with his community here, he left, and he moved to Carolina. The last visit I have recorded of him was in 1787, and he eventually died in South Carolina, which he's buried there in 1792. The one thing that he did do while he was here was, I said, he was a great marketer and promoter. He realised that if he could put New Perth on the deeds of land, very attractive to people back in Scotland and Ireland, he might want to come over, because New Perth meant fertile land, great chance to make a good living, because Perth in Scotland is famously fertile and a great agricultural land. And Clark just did that. He wrote to everybody he knew, and he sent someone from his congregation, unknown, to actually visit people to promote. And he had a good reason. He was liable for the rents. So if he didn't fill up all of those leases, his name was on the payments. So he was highly motivated to move the land. Harper, he was, as I said, was engaged in a scandal in Columbia. He lost his job. He ended up becoming the librarian. But when the revolution broke out, he chose the right side. So he joined the militia, Washington's militia, served in the administration. He was in the New York Assembly, and he became the Assistant Secretary for the state of New York. So quite a significant political figure. He is believed to be one of the people responsible for many of the classical place names of cities and towns in New York. He's a classical scholar. And Harpersville, New York, and Harper College, part of Binghamton University, are both named after Robert Harper. So those two. So that's the history part. I didn't want it to go any longer than this, but a few more minutes. What I wanted to do now is just change it up completely. I wanted to take you on my little journey, because this started out for me as a photographic project, not a history project at all. I'm not a historian. What I wanted to do in 2023 was get in my car with the help of David Nesbitt and others, and try and follow the route that Clark and his community had taken overland, and photograph some of the key places and try and make a reference back to the past. And so it took me through 3 counties, Monaghan, Armagh and Down, which means that I had to cross the border. Now, in previous times, that was a difficult undertaking, because the Monaghan-Armagh border was referred to as bandit country, and that was actually quite a dangerous place to be, but not anymore. So there's that map again. So very quickly, it's Ballybay's about here, and then the road sort of comes up through there and then down to Neeley. It's 50 miles as the car flies. I did some research. In the 1700s, the British Army allowed its troops 17.5 miles a day on a forced march. So I'm thinking men, women and children with all their household goods, not going to be moving that fast. They didn't have horses, they wouldn't have had wagons, it would have been probably all on foot, carried maybe with a barrow. So I'm thinking many days to walk, and the weather in Ireland can be very unpredictable. So this is Ballybay itself, and it rains a lot in Ireland. But it's not like rain here. It's what my mother called mizzling. It's just gentle, soft, but it's wet. And that's Ballybay on a quiet evening. One of the features of the town, like a lot of small towns in rural Ireland, and I suspect like rural towns in the United States, many things are closed down. There are a lot of boarded up shops, there's a lot of empty premises. The great casualty is the pubs. Now, I thought the Irish had a lot of churches, but not as many as they have pubs. I counted at least 12 premises in the high street of Ballybay that were pubs at one stage. Most of them now closed, like this one, but it's a sign that over the years I noticed on trips with my mother The town is not what it was. It used to have one of the biggest horse fairs in Ireland. That side of agriculture has all but disappeared. This is the old market house. This is when Ballybay would have been at its absolute peak in the 1800s. Quite a busy, wealthy agricultural market town. It's a historic building. As far as I know, it hasn't been opened in 50 years. This is the countryside around the Cahans meeting house. I mean, it's a beautiful old building, but it's literally in a cow field. And their neighbour runs his cows. He gets very irritated during events at the meeting house because people park in his access. And he can't get in to deal with his cows. But you can see that the countryside. People ask me, why is there a meeting house there? The Presbyterians were not allowed to build a place of worship in the town. Under the penal laws, it had to be, I'm told, 10 miles or 8 miles outside. I haven't seen that verified, but they weren't allowed to build actually in the town. Close to the meeting house along this little road is what remains of Riddle's flax mill. So this would have been a mill where the household workers who, when they harvested their flax, their hemp, and they would beat it and pound it at home, would bring their products to probably for finishing or even the raw materials. And these little flax mills are dotted all over the countryside. They're just disused and abandoned. But it's a reminder that it was the way that people survived in rural Ireland, rural Monaghan. Potatoes were just for food. There was no money in it, that was just diet. And they lived off that. This is a place called Scotch Corner. And it is obviously named after the Scots settlers were there. It's another example of the changes in Ireland. A neighbour came out to ask me what I was doing. It's amazing how a stranger was noticed immediately. She said that both of these houses on the left-hand side used to be a pub and a hotel, long gone, and on the other side was either a shop or something, so that, again, an example of the change that's occurred. But it's still called Scotch Corner, and there's absolutely no doubt that on the old road that Clark and his crew would have walked this particular road on their way. Agriculture is huge in Monaghan now. Usually large-scale commercial farming. Dairy is quite important, beef cattle is important, but they also have massive poultry farming and mushrooms, industrial-scale mushroom farming, and furniture. That struck me as unusual, but they have a big furniture industry. This is the main street of a town called Castle Blaney, which is on the road that they would have followed. This is a very typical Monaghan country town. You can see the architecture, and you can see how quiet it is. A lot of these towns really struck me is that after 6 o'clock at night, there's nothing open. Even the pubs were closed. They were very quiet. There was not much going on at all. That's a sign of what people make a living out of, livestock and cattle, which should resonate with folks around here. Interesting parallels in industries. I'd forgotten, of course, that Ireland is a bilingual country, and is increasingly so, and Gaelic is making a real comeback, and is very widely spoken and very widely encouraged. So in the south of Ireland, you have bilingual road signs, and just to confuse our American visitors, European speed limits. It's not miles an hour, that's kilometres an hour. And as you cross the border, it flips. So as soon as I cross the border into the English side, back to miles an hour, and it's a problem. Along the roadside, beautiful countryside, but there are remnants of the past, abandoned houses, abandoned cottages, abandoned buildings that just line the roads. They're very common sights through the countryside. This is the border. So just near that yellow curved sign there, this is the border between just on this spot between north and south. No border controls, no customs, no TSA, no armed police, not anymore. But just your GPS going, border warning, border warning, border warning. And because the Irish border is so snaky, you can cross and recross the border half a dozen times in 20 minutes. Just in and out. And it's no wonder that when the Troubles were in full flight, that the British military could not control that border. It is so difficult to deal with. So there's no warning, and of course in Clark's time there was no border there at all. This is the town of Newtown Butler, and this was one of the hotspots for sectarian violence during the 70s, 80s and into the 90s. In the centre of town is a police station that looks like Fort Knox, and I really didn't want to take any photographs. People are still quite edgy about that sort of thing, but right in the middle of the town is this fortified barracks with the corrugated iron sheeting, barbed wire, bulletproof approaches. I don't think there's any real violence anymore, but it's just a reminder. And Newtown Butler is famous because it was the site of one of the biggest battles between William's forces and James during the wars of leading up to the Battle of the Boyne, and it's a big victory for the Unionist forces and is celebrated as part of the annual marches. Beautiful countryside around there. It's really a delight to drive around. This was during, I think silage or silage. Is that something you're familiar with here? And you do not want to meet one of those on one of those laneways that I just. Because I'm not bad at reversing, but not for 300 yards up a narrow lane. And one of these things, that's it. You have to go back over. So this was in full swing when I was there across, and you can see the drumlin there, that sort of gentle hill. Irish road signs. Now, if you're not confused by that, you're a better driver than I am. I have no idea what that meant. And as I stood there looking at it, cars are just going. And I think these guys are as confused as I was. I don't know anything about farm animals. What I realised, if you walk up to a farm gate in Ireland, all the cows. They ran from up near that hedge at the back, and then discovered it wasn't who they thought it was. Again, the countryside. This is getting close to Newry, and this is a small town outside Newry, and this is a reminder that the political element of the north is still very much alive. This is one of the murals. The man illustrated in the mural is one of the victims of the hunger strikes in Belfast, the IRA hunger strikers. This would be, County Down is predominantly Protestant, not a Unionist. This would be probably a small Catholic nationalist enclave, and that's very typical of the political statements that you will see from time to time in the north, reminding people of the recent past.
What does it say?
I can't read Gaelic. Sorry, the bottom, it says, keep on marching and don't give up. I assume that's what the Gaelic at the top also says. This is Newry itself. It's quite a beautiful town, well worth a visit. As I said, it's on the water, and this is the Newry Canal, which was built in 1742, and that was the thing that made Newry wealthy, was that it connected it to the inland lakes. And for a while it eclipsed Belfast, but not for that long. Again, the waterfront in Newry. But what I discovered about Newry, which was a little sort of segue to my story, is that these churches are on a thing called Sugar Island. And it only dawned on me when I was there that the reason it's called Sugar Island is because all the sugar from the enslaved plantations in the Caribbean and the West Indies was brought here for processing. And there was a very big sugar processing industry in Newry, very wealthy merchant class involved. And the last one was an American connection, which I've mentioned to a few people since I've been here. A guy called Thomas Mitchell, who was one of the Sons of Ireland, a political freedom fighter and a Presbyterian, who was born in Newry and was transported as a convict to Australia for his troubles, for rebelling against the English. He escaped from Australia and found his way to the United States, and he fought as a general in the Confederate Army in the Civil War. His two sons were killed fighting for the Confederacy, and he is one of the most ardent and outspoken and vociferous supporters of slavery on record, despite spending most of his life fighting for Irish freedom from the British. And there is a petition in Newry to have that statue removed. And I won't go into that argument. and last of all, you've seen this picture already I wanted to include these last two pictures. These are the famous Mountains of Mourne. So any of you who follow Irish music may know that particular folk song. This would have been the last thing that Clark and his people would have seen as they left Newry. Because as you come out of the river into the loch, Carlingford Loch, the Mountains of Mourne sweep down on one side and the Ring of Galleons on the other. And then you're in the Irish Sea, and then they would have been on their way to the United States. So you get this last look of land, looking out to sea. And to them, I can't imagine what they were thinking as they embarked across the Atlantic from there. So I wanted to close with a little observation on the Cahans project, which is essentially about the renovation and restoration of this magnificent meeting hall. And I couldn't help but, since I've been here, see the parallels between both your community usage for the old courthouse, which I was very struck by, is how a historic building has been adapted to really wonderful community space. And also just going to the White Church this morning, which is really another incredibly beautiful place of worship. And they seem to be a mirror of each other in many ways. It's quite a beautiful building and a lovely location. That's my photograph from 2014 when it was being renovated. Since 2023, they have fundraised, raffles, they have a charity shop, and these are the two of the wonderful folks in the charity shop, Charlie Barker and Sadie McDonnell. They're the volunteers. Do you call them charity shops here? Yeah, we call them op shops, opportunity shops. So they're volunteers, and one of the big fundraisers for the restoration has been this charity shop. And I love this. This is do-it-yourself marketing. So they're promoting the opening. I don't know if you can read it. Official opening, Cahans Meeting House, open invitation, tea and refreshments, handwritten note, and if you want to buy a pair of shoes as well. A couple of shots of the interior of the restored building, and this is of the opening itself, and you can see the change in the building, and trying to sort of bring people in. They have concerts, live music, which is fabulous. And as you can see from this, it is a real community space, and people from all walks of life, all religions, all professions came together for the opening. This gentleman is actually from South Carolina. He is a pastor at one of the theological colleges, and my understanding is that he did his doctoral dissertation on the Reverend Thomas Clark. Although I've never been able to find a copy of it. He donned costume of the period to do a reenactment of the time, which was rather interesting. I actually really like this picture. This is sort of a sense of what it was like, sort of just people coming together very informally.
With a dog.
Yeah. Kind of like that. More music. And this should mean something to you folks. So this is the wonderful David Nesbitt and his wife Elsie, who were very, very good to me. And they are very proud of the mural behind them, the hanging, which comes from Salem. Correct?
Yes.
And they are very proud of that, and really wanted me to make sure in my photograph that I had it, and just in case they ever got to show it. And David wrote to me to say that that is now on permanent display in the Cahans Meeting House as a sign of their connection. I think it dates back 2014 or thereabouts. Yeah. And the one thing David said to me is that he said he would love to pick up on the connection, which he thinks has dropped off a bit. He wonders that what can be done. I wouldn't presume to tell people how to do it, but I think there are some ideas that might work. So I just wanted to close on that note and sort of give you a sense of the personal and the contemporary, and come back to Mark Twain's observation that history might not repeat, but I think it certainly rhymes. Thank you so much. 40 minutes.
That's okay.
Anyway, so thank you. I really appreciate your attention and your patience. And you didn't need an interpreter for my accent. Does anyone have any questions or any observations or corrections for me? Yes, please.
A question. Is there a list of the people that came?
There is a list. I don't have it on me. You can find it on the internet. I think there is a comprehensive list of the names.
Tony, I have a picture of it on my phone. I don't know if there's a way to get it up there or not.
Have we got an IT expert? Please.
When the people were here and around Lake George, did I hear correctly that the people didn't like Lake George because it was so desolate and came to Salem because it was different?
I think we've read some of the statements from them. They were horrified at this dark, evil, dangerous wilderness, the terrible snow, the winter. I think it was the shock of their first winter. That would be my guess, is they had never experienced anything like this.
And were they all flax growers at home and expected to do the same thing here?
Everybody would have survived on flax and linen.
And did they transfer to sheep or some other means?
Here?
We do
Because
have
we have
flax
lots of-
mills here.
I'm not aware that any of them went into flax weaving here. I'm not aware of it. They may have. Al?
Yeah, just to point out, there were flax mills here in town. There was one on West Broadway, but flax was the predominant crop. And before cows came along, there were like 500,000 sheep here in the county. That was the farm, sheep and flax.
Mm-hmm. So it was. That's great. I didn't know that. So maybe they did have an outlet for that skill. I wasn't aware of it. But Monaghan's peculiarly damp clay soil is ideal for hemp and flaxen cultivation. Best part of Ireland, and my understanding is the Huguenots, when they were expelled from France, introduced high-level or industrial scale flax and linen making to the Irish because they took it up a level. But I didn't know that it was here in the States.
I got the list of names. I don't know if there's a way to cast out up there. Or...
You can email it to him and then he can project his email. That's the only way you'll probably
I don't think.
be able to quickly do it.
David.
Have you got Wi-Fi here?
Right.
I have an interest in how many people here
Email
may
it
be
to you.
related to the original settlers.
That's what I was just going to ask. Could we have a show of hands?
I want to get a picture.
So, I was going to ask you, if you don't
Okay, show of
mind,
hands.
you go first. Before you leave, if you do have time, I'm actually out of here tomorrow morning, unfortunately, but I do plan to visit Ireland in May, and I hope to reciprocate something with the community there. If you wouldn't mind staying back, I'd love to get a photograph and your name and something that I can take back, because I know David and the others are very interested in knowing about who is here that they can understand is linked back to that group. It's really quite exciting for them to be able to know that.
Great.
Yeah.
Yes, I should identify. I may be the only Presbyterian minister here.
Oh, I hope I haven't offended you in any way.
No. I am not fire and brimstone. All that is to say that with regard, I'm so fascinated by the church history and religious history, and I would love to identify myself with David Nisbet and make that connection. I mean, even in terms of exchange and pilgrimage and the like. Back in that time, so much was afoot. You mentioned the succeeders, but also within the Church of Scotland, there the Covenanters.
Yes.
And without getting into the weeds on all that, I'm intrigued, and I wonder if you might have any sense as to whether or not Reverend Clark and his folks, upon arriving in Ireland, might have considered a return to Scotland, where the Church of Scotland was more operative, and in some of the steps with the reformers at that time, there was, the tension with and even attitude in tension with the Church of Rome, and here is
Interesting, yeah. I've seen that, yeah.
The dynamics of them distinguish. Not to get too much into that, but I'm so intrigued with the migrations, in and about religious freedom, and there could have been that return to Scotland, but instead here came the New World. And I wonder any comments on that.
I have seen no suggestion or any evidence of any entreaties or ideas of return to Scotland.
Yeah.
And maybe the circumstances of the departure were so onerous, because their circumstances when they left for Ireland were of disastrous harvests, drought, near famine conditions. I doubt that there would have been a huge interest in going back. That's my assumption. But what I've seen is that, again, there's a lot in this, but the first Presbyterian immigrants to the United States, it's already started in the middle 1600s. So there's actually a long lead time to this. So it wasn't just overnight the letters started arriving. It looks like from about the 1660s, 70s and 80s, the first communities came here, and that's when they started to make the connections, and gradually it just built up. So
well, exactly. And one note on that really brings us home to Salem in so many ways is that the white church had its beginnings in 1700. And it wasn't until Clark came that in 1790 there was another, dynamic with Presbyterian churches beginning. So
yes.
That 1700 founding really dates back to some of the early beginnings coming from the 1600 migration, and the first Presbytery was out of Philadelphia in 1706. So it's interesting that there was no connection for the Presbyterians with Clark with the white church lineage, and I'm just curious about that.
Way above my pay grade. Look, you are right. The complexities of the internal church matters are really something. I mean, it's a study in itself to get through it. Yeah.
I'm so glad.
But I would be very happy to talk to you and put you in touch with David.
Thank you so much.
Tony, just
Al.
to bring up to date, the other way to make a living in here, when the Dessaint famine drove the Irish to this country, a lot of them were settled in Salem, in Hebron, and in Argyll, and they grew potatoes. That was the huge crop. The second group of Irish that came in 1852, because they built the railroad from Albany to Vermont. So you have one group was basically Protestant Irish, and another group was Catholic Irish. You may notice, well, you might not have noticed, but the Presbyterian, the other Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Methodist churches are built right here in the center of town. The Catholic had to build in the north end. And the group of housing there is known as Irish Town. So some of the people here would remember that, but some would not know that. So
I recall this sort of semblance of a joke that the reason the Irish did that, the Irish Catholics did that, was that they had to convince themselves they were the only ones.
Well, the Presbyterians are also known as the chosen.
I was going to share the story that I shared with you at the church.
Oh, please do.
And don't know whether it's 100% true, but my mother was always like the storyteller and stuff, but maybe Al can do it. The connection with our Carolina church affiliate. There was the year of no summer. I don't know if you heard that. So whatever volcano, which one did you think was?
Krakatoa, I think, was the eruption.
Yeah. So they got so desperate up here, they were down to like whatever last things they had to eat because the crops would fail, everything was failing, and they were down to, somehow word got to the congregation that was in the Carolinas about how desperate they were. They drove an entire flock of sheep all the way north and saved the people up here so they could
some story. One of the anecdotes about Clark, it just reminded me of it. He was famously fundamentalist and opposed all iniquities, gaming, whoring, swearing, and he refused to travel on the Sabbath. But apparently he was caught up in a snowstorm or something and he had no choice, and the only lodging he could find was an inn, which was just, he said, you know, I was surrounded by iniquity. And but he got up in the morning and he realised that there was a group of men gathering for a horse race. And he went out and got up on his soapbox and inveighed them against the evils of gaming and horse racing. And they cancelled the horse meet and went home. And that was the end of Saratoga. Now, I don't know how true that is, but it's consistent with all the anecdotes about Clark, is that he, that what they said, if you encountered Clark on the road, you would not be long in knowing you had met a man of Christ. He was just straight into it. You know. I love that story. Any other questions, comments?
Can I ask, because you've mentioned a few times Ballybay wanting connection with Salem, and then again, I am now realizing that there has been some connection with Ballybay, but what ideas did you have about creating stronger ties with them?
Well, one of the things that's really struck me since I've been in town talking to people is that you have a surprisingly, I'm sorry to say that, vibrant arts and cultural scene for such a small town. Yeah. Like you actually have a theatre company, which I can't believe. You have some art space, you have the Salem artworks and things. Look, it's not meant to be a criticism. I think that David Nesbitt and the others frame their connections very much within a church paradigm. They see themselves as linking one Presbyterian community with another, which is great. But I'm thinking that perhaps the Ballybay town connection, which would cover the arts, culture, community, some other things, might be a broader way to build that connection. And they fit into that because they have a wonderful space that you could have artist exchanges, artist in residence. You could have and it seems to me that there are a number of different ways. I was talking to Tom before about your fabulous project to put the codes on the headstones. You know, to scan the barcodes and people can have stories of what they're looking at. These are the sorts of things that could really breathe life into their heritage stories. But they often, I think sometimes it's sharing of ideas as much as, it doesn't have to be people physically going from one place to another, but even sharing sometimes simple ways that might not have occurred to them to do it. I don't know that Ballybay's got a library. I can't think that it might have. But even simple.
How big is Ballybay?
It's not that big. I think it's population of several thousand.
Okay. Do they have a library?
I think it was closed when I was there. It certainly wasn't anything like you've got here. It struck me as like this library is open for 2 hours every second Monday. But in Monaghan, the county, like the main town, they have a fabulous museum, a brand new museum, and David and I both know the curator of the Monaghan Museum, and I've often thought that there surely is scope for an exhibition about this story.
An art museum you're talking about?
It's a general museum. It's not just art, it's a cultural museum.
Yeah.
Well, I mean that could be that could be included, and by coincidence, the curator is a third cousin of mine. It turns out, so I didn't know that. Don't know if I've got any pull there, but so yeah, I've got a few ideas, but because I'm not there and I'm not here, it's a little difficult to get sort of intrude into it. But I do see some potential for it. And I know David would be absolutely delighted to hear from anybody.
You have David's contact info?
I certainly do. What I'll do is, they have a website for the Cahans project. I think they even have a Facebook page. I wouldn't say it's terribly active, but they've got one. And I can provide all. Is there someone I could channel that through?
We could
Send it
Okay,
to
do
the
you think we could put
library.
it on the library's site? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I should have put it up actually when I think about it.
And I guess I have one more question too. Is the church still actively being used
Yes.
as a church?
No,
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 okay.
it's been decommissioned.
Okay.
So it's no longer used as a place of worship. So First Presbyterian, I think, has its own separate church now. No, it's a cultural and community space, which they have concerts and talks and activities in.
And what's David's name?
Nesbitt.
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 No.
You could also compile some of this and put it in the Salem Press.
And as I said, if anyone wants to, he's written a couple of excellent, well, it's the same book, it's the second edition of his history of Presbyterianism in the county.
Cool. So that's information you could share with the...
Yeah, I can do that. So,
Tony, before everybody goes home, can we get a picture of you and the descendants? And
oh yeah, that's a great
also
idea.
the Nesbitts, and
Yeah.
we'll get a picture, it'd be nice, the continuity.
Let's do that.